Very well. So now what we have to do, we know that the goal of anything is to maximize profits. So now what we have to do is to try to find a rule to answer the following question. How much output you should produce in order to maximize profits? That's the question we're going to try to answer. How much output you should produce, how many barbecue sandwiches you should produce in order to maximize your profits? Well, see if we can put this into context by giving you kind of an application before I give you the answer. Say that you produce, again, barbecue sandwiches, or you can change barbecue sandwiches or whatever thing you wanted to produce. And say that at the current level of production, your average total costs, which we talked about already, right? Your average total costs are $4.08. And that you have a price for every barbecue sandwich. You price about $8, which is what kind of Mike said that he would charge $7.95. Now, if that is the case, and you wanted to increase your profits, what should you do? Should you produce more sandwiches, less sandwiches? Or should you continue to produce the same number of sandwiches you were doing before? Can you answer that question with the information you have? So can you answer the question with the information you have? Well, let's see. You know how much profit you're making. In fact, you can actually calculate the profit per unit you're making. The profit per unit you're making is going to be the average, the revenue per unit, which is a price, $8, minus the cost per unit, which is, which I'm telling you, 408. And then how many units you will need, how many units you make. But in order to answer that, you might actually need, in order for you to see if what you're doing is the best, you actually may need more information than what you have. Let me explain that by bringing back the table that we were using last week. So this is the same table we have been using last week. And the only thing I'm adding here is the profits, which we already know how to calculate, right? The profits are going to be equal to the revenue minus the cost. So when you have one cook and you produce 40 barbecue sandwiches, your profits are $140. And the way you get that is by taking the profits at that level is going to be the price, the revenue per unit, minus the average total cost, the cost per unit, times how many units you produce. So in this case, it's going to be 8. When you have one cook, it's going to be 8 minus 450 times 40, which is the unit you produce. And that's going to be equal to $140. So when you have one cook, 40 units, you make a profit of $140. When you have two cooks, you produce 90 sandwiches, you have $460. When you have three cooks, you make 120 sandwiches, you have $620. 4 cooks, $660. 5 cooks, $620. And when you have 6 cooks in the kitchen, you produce 142 sandwiches, and your profits are $556, which again is the situation that I just gave you in the question, right? So in that question, I was telling you that your cost per unit was $4.08, and your price was $8. And I asked you, should you actually produce more or less? Well, you don't know much, just from the question, but now that you see the table, it is clear that if you reduce the quantity of sandwiches from 142 to 140, if you get rid of one of your cooks, and instead of having 6 cooks, you have 5 cooks, you will actually make $620 in profits instead of $556. So clearly, if you get rid of that cook, your profits go up. So if you actually are making, if you knew that, then your answer would have been that you should produce less sandwiches. Because by producing less sandwiches, you get rid of more costs than revenue and your profits go up. But you didn't know that, so clearly you couldn't answer that question. And the key here that you need to know is that you need to know the marginal costs. You need to know how much your costs change when you hire the last cook, or how much your costs change when you produce the last sandwich. If you don't know that, you can't answer the question. But now that you know that, at least for this table, it is clear that if you want to maximize profits, the number of units you should produce should be 135 sandwiches, which is $660 in profits. Now, to understand why that is the best you can do, let's see what will be the result of doing something different. So let's say you're producing 135 units of sandwiches, 135 sandwiches with 4 cooks. Let's say that you decide to, well, I'm doing well, let's hire another cook and produce more sandwiches. Let's say that you want to move from 135 to 140 sandwiches. Well, if you produce 140 sandwiches, your costs are actually changing by how much? Well, you have how many more units you produce? You have 5 more units. Q, the change in Q is 5 units of Q. And then your change in cost, well, your average total cost goes from $3.08 to $3.57, right? So your average total cost increase by 357 minus 311. So your average total cost is increasing by that much, right? The change in your average total cost. And every unit, you have 5 more units, so you're actually adding that much cost. So what I'm calculating here is what we have been calling the marginal cost of producing from 135 to 140. The change in total cost of the 140th unit will be the change in cost over the change in output. All right? So the bottom will be that 5 units, which is the additional units that the worker brings, the 5th worker brings. And on the top will be the additional cost, which will be the 357 minus 311. All right? So that turns out to be $16. So when you actually hire another worker, the 140th unit increases your cost by $16. Now, how much money are you making on that 140th unit? You're only making $8. So when you make that 140th unit, you're adding $16 of cost to your operation, and you're already adding $8 of revenue, so clearly your profits will go up. Your profit will go down. Why? Well, because that extra person, that extra cook, only adds output of 5 units. You're paying that person the same, so that person is increasing your cost by a lot, by $16, and yet you're charging $8. So clearly you should not hire that other person, because if you hire that other person, the amount of output that other person brings you is not enough to cover the cost that you have to charge, the revenue that you make in the sandwiches. So if you were using 5 cooks and you were making a profit of $6.20, if you wanted to increase your profits, you should get rid of that 5th person and increase your profit to $6.60. Now, how about if you were actually using 3 cooks and making 120 sandwiches? Well, you see that if we calculate the marginal cost, the actual marginal cost of the 135th unit was actually $5.33. So when you produce the 135th sandwich, your cost increased by $5.33 per unit. How much did you make on that unit? $8. So clearly you made more money on that unit, extra, that you actually increased your cost. So that 135th unit actually increases your profits. So you should produce it, because that unit will increase your profits. Now beyond that, you should stop, because then your additional costs are more. So let's summarize what we just said looking at the table. What we just said is that the profits, which is in this symbol here, is going to be the revenue minus the cost, right? So whenever the last unit you produce add this much revenue and only this much cost, then your profit go up. Because the last unit, your marginal revenue of the last unit, was actually larger than the marginal cost of the last unit, or the additional cost of the last unit, and your profit go up. So when your marginal revenue is more than your marginal cost, you should produce more, or continue to produce, right? Produce more. Now, on the other hand, when your revenue of the last unit increased by only this much, but the cost of the last unit increases by that much, then in that case, your marginal revenue of the last unit was less than your marginal cost, and your profits went down. So when your marginal revenue is less than your marginal cost, when the additional revenue of the last unit was less than the additional cost of that unit, you should cut production in order to or cut that, so you can get rid of more cost then. So you should produce less or cut production. And if you produce less, you get rid of more cost than revenue. And you know you're doing the best when your marginal revenue equals your marginal cost, then that is the highest profits. So when we ask that question at the beginning, what is the rule that you would use to decide how much to produce and to maximize profits? This is a rule right here. In order to maximize profits, any business should produce at a point in which the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. Now, at this point, you might be asking, well, I mean, we're making a huge assumption here, which is that the price always ends up being $8. So we're going to talk about that assumption in our next section.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.